Okay, so I have with me the Venerable Dr. Patitsas and Dr. Schindler. Dr. Schindler is the professor of metaphysics and anthropology at the John Paul II Institute, and Dr. Patitsas is the former dean of Hellenic College and professor of ethics at Holy Cross. Thank you guys both so much for taking the time. I'm pretty excited about this.
Thanks for the opportunity. I've long wanted to meet Dr. Patitsas, so
Yeah, I'm
so
glad it can happen.
Yes, likewise.
All right, so we have a list of provisional topics here. Um, the first, I kind of like to move into the specifics and start with something a little more general. So, having read both of your work, less of yours, Dr. Schindler, unfortunately, I started reading Love and the Postmodern Condition last night. I made a good distance, but it took me a while to find a library that had a copy. They're all checked out, so it's good. It's good.
good
It's a good sign.
sign. Yeah.
But initially, I think we could start off talking about what's the future of work.
Mhm.
A lot of the theologies of the 20th century were trying to re-ontologize meaningfulness and move away from um, philosophies of disincarnation and things like that by seeking refuge in work, finding a way to ontologize work. But then with AI and everything like that, the question of authorship and reproduction and things like this have really called into question what work means, what's specifically human about work. And I know both of your stuff addresses this question, so I'd like to hear your thoughts about it.
Uh, who
Dr.
would you
Schindler,
like to start?
yes.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, work is maybe surprisingly fruitful area for philosophical reflection. You think of it as a practical necessity. One often thinks of it as sort of a necessary evil. Nobody likes to work, but we all need things, and so work is a means of producing things. And you can see if that's the way you understand work, it lends itself always to this ideal of discovering ways of providing, achieving the purpose of work without having to go through the process. And so, in the ancient world, you had slaves that would then free up the rest for culture, for contemplation. And now we have increasingly automation of various sorts, mechanical initially, but increasingly even intellectual automation in AI. But it seems to me that this ideal is really a dangerous one, or at least it's something that uh, ought to uh, that warrants more reflection than we tend to give to it. And the key reflection, I could go on for a very long time, so I'm going to try to keep this short, just to open up a conversation, because I'm sure Dr. Patitsas has a lot to say here too. It seems to me that the key is that we have to understand the way in which work is an intrinsic good and not merely an instrumental good. And there'd be a number of ways to get to that question, but one really sort of direct way is to look at the book of Genesis. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the account of creation. It's very interesting that work was one of the original commands given to man. It's something that seems to be coincident with human nature. The original commands were, on the one hand, be fruitful, multiply, so marriage and family, and then the other hand, to work, to subdue the earth, to till the garden. Those two commandments, I think, are the constitutive realities of the human being. And if you read Genesis carefully, you see that work, it's eventually cursed, as are the realities of marriage and family get cursed um, uh, as a consequence of original sin. But the reality precedes the curse and precedes the sin. They had an intrinsically good meaning before that. God didn't create Adam to till the earth because that would be the only way that this work would get done. God could have created, you might say, a flourishing garden, but it was gratuitously given to Adam to work the garden. And so there's an indication there that there's something about that kind of participation in the act of creation, which is already in itself uh, a blessing, something good, something precious, something constitutive of human nature, independently of the fruits that it bears. It's first, of course, it's important that it bear fruit, but that's not what constitutes its goodness. There's something even more basic. Now there'll be a lot to say about that, but I'll just maybe just leave that there as an initial observation, and see where the conversation goes. But the point is simply that, if we look for ways of getting rid of work and simply getting the products that it would otherwise have provided, we're reducing it to a pure instrumental good and then replacing it with something else. And I think that we're going to do some profound damage. We're going to lose sight of something that's really essential to our humanity if we follow that out.
Yeah, what else would we do? I come at the question, as a disciple of Jane Jacobs, and seeing that, for her, one of the importancies of work is that it gives us the opportunity to develop new work on the basis of the work we're doing. And what follows pretty quickly when you look at her 1968 work, The Economy of Cities, is that the economy is a kind of Eucharist, and it centers on moments of insight. So there's no work that people do that isn't married to some insight about, in her terms, the nature of the work you're doing, the processes that you're currently undertaking, the materials you're using, the problems you're solving. So there's always an insight which has to be brought into, made incarnational for the life of the world. So, work and then liturgy as kind of the ultimate work,
Yeah.
They exist along some kind of a spectrum. Maybe it's a spectrum with quantum gaps, but nevertheless, so that's our job, is this Eucharistic and incarnational role, this priestly role, is to look. Is it Zizioulas who wrote in a famous article, man, the priest of creation, saying that we weren't just the stewards of creation, but I think someone needs to write a third, man, the prophet of creation. And that's really what Jane Jacobs is seeing, that somehow, in her early work, it's messages. There are messages in the work we're doing that are, that the innovator is open to, receives the message and brings them into life for the life of the world. And her final works, it's not just messages, it's invitations is the term she uses. So it's even more somehow personified. The problem with AI, as I see it, is nobody will know what work is being done. It's the same as the problem of offshoring everything. You don't know what the heck is going on. So you cannot, your so-called knowledge class has nothing to chew on. It doesn't know what's going right and what's going wrong in the production or in the products. So it's not a locus of new insights. And Elon Musk, has been really stressing, the Model Y is now the most American car in terms of, where it's manufactured for sale in the United States, that the engineers have to make it to the factory floor and figure out what's happening. You cannot have these insights, and that's Jane Jacobs 101. It's the parent work that is the minimal condition for new insight.
That's really, the connection between work and insight, I think, is an outstanding one and really worth pursuing and reflecting on. I teach a class on work. It's called Dominion and Technique at the Institute. We spend some time reflecting on. So I approach it as sort of a new chapter in the theology of the body. John Paul II is famous for developing a theology of the body a teaching on marriage and family that looks at the sexual organs as, in a way, an inscription into the flesh of man's calling to love, the fact that we're meant to give ourselves to another. And it seems to me that we can think about work also from that perspective. In this case, it's the hands, right, that are the inscription in the flesh of this. And I think it's also a calling to love, but of a different sort. It's in and through our hands in a way that we extend out into the world. The sexual organs are meant to be within the nature, human nature. It's an intimate, internal to human nature, only a man and woman together. But the hands are precisely an extension, you might say, of the human out into the world other than the human. And there if we think about the hands in that way, they become precisely, there's so much going on there, but in one respect, it's an encounter with what is really radically other. And that encounter is both creative, our hands are expression of freedom and intelligence, but also receptive. We get to know things that there's some things you can only know by getting your hands into them, by tinkering, by working with your hands. There've been some really fascinating books written about the special kind of knowledge we know with our hands. We don't just know with our minds, we know with our hands. And the kind of knowledge that we receive through our hands is essentially incarnational, and embodied. It can't be translated into information. This is something that, no matter how sophisticated artificial intelligence becomes, it will never know what it's like to work with your hands. And machines can't perceive. That would be something we're thinking about. I'll set that aside. But obviously, it's not only work is not only manual work. There is increasingly, intellectual work, and of course, that's the kind of work I do. I'm a professor. I'm not a worker with my hands. But it seems to me it changes everything if we think of manual work in that sense as a kind of a paradigm, a model, by analogy to which we understand all other kinds of work. It would tend to give one's attitude towards work in every dimension of life a bit more of this incarnational, this groundedness, this fruitfulness, this organic. It would have more of an organic sort of character. It would be concrete. And I think that, thinking that is modeled on getting involved in the world through your hands is radically different from the kind of thinking that is modeled on computation and sort of computer analysis. Those are two very different ways of thinking about thinking, and they imply very different ways of approaching every single kind of work.
And certainly that seems to point to the priesthood as kind of the ultimate, with those hands offering the gifts and receiving them back, and those hands being blessed through that particular work. I think, that embodiment, extends beyond the hands. And like in the case of asceticism, like we don't really trust a theologian who isn't also an ascetic, and who isn't, learning what they know theologically at the cost of their own destruction, or whatever the term is, their own self-sacrifice. It somehow it is a bodily thing. Theology is known bodily in the eating and drinking of the body and blood, and also in the just the endurance, the ascetic endurance.
That's, we sacrifice for something real and good and true. I think that one of the things that this reflection on work can open up is a sense of how much how a properly human being in the world involves a kind of sacrificial sense of relating to what is other. So if we think of work in this concrete sense that we've been indicating, you mentioned that there's a kind of a fruitfulness to it. It engenders more work. There's this organic kind of metaphor, and the fruitfulness is. It seems to me it's always going to be bear witness to and be productive of real things of genuine intrinsic beauty, first of all, goodness and truth, around which community can form. We can actually commune with each other in relation to things that are intrinsically good. If we think of work in purely instrumental terms as just providing things for our material needs or intellectual needs or just desires, we don't have the sense of producing things around which community can be born. And then our political life, our common life together, increasingly takes the shape of just a kind of arena set for each of us to pursue our own individual desires. So it's really interesting from the simple point of what is work and how is it good, in what sense is work good. You begin to unfold a whole sense of the cosmos, a whole sense of political order, what it means to be together, and I think then and theological order ultimately. I mean that is very much wrapped up in this way of thinking.
It's very good. It's very good. And of course, that I guess is a natural extension, or it should have been for me, about seeing the work is in this Eucharistic term that it creates. Certainly, it's not work is not only incarnational in that it involves, embodying insight, but that and then of course the product of work is always further embodied insight if it's good work. But it's also about keeping body and soul together for the people who need shelter and need all the things that work do. I mean, they keep us incarnate.
Yeah.
So I think that instrumentality is okay,
Right.
but it's only part of the story, and it's I keep wanting to talk about. Well, no, go ahead.
I always insist. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with instrumentality and making money and all those kinds of things. I mean, that's but it's a question of order, and it seems to me it's very different if you make something simply in order to get a profit, or you make something because it's intrinsically good, and knowing that it's intrinsically good, you expect to receive a profit from it, and even demand money, that. So it's not a matter of like how important something like money is or all these other things. It's where they fit in the bigger picture. And it seems to me it's crucial for a human economy that those instrumental dimensions be nested in intrinsic values.
Yes.
That's
the nesting is the thing.
Yeah.
Yes. Well,
I don't know if you're familiar with Matthew Crawford.
I am. Yes, he's in the atmosphere.
Yeah, he's got this wonderful book called Shop Class as Soulcraft, and that was his first book, and he's written a number of very interesting things since then. But I was thinking about your comment with Elon Musk and how how the manager needs to actually be on the floor and see what's being done. I was prompted to think of this because of your comment about separating body and soul and the need to keep body and soul together. I mean, that means staying alive, but it also means integrating our soul and body. And it's so interesting to think of the kind of division of labor that has occurred, that characterizes so much of the modern economy as precisely separating soul and body. You have people that are just the intellectual, they design stuff without making any of it, and then you have the people that do all the making without any thought. And in a way, this is like a symbolic expression of this division of body and soul, which is death.
Yeah, I don't know when she hit on this, if it was already in the 1950s or more like the 80s, but Jane Jacobs thought, like, she had these different moments, like, to when should you date the decline of the United States? And for her, it was 1933.
Okay.
She had a year, but she also had a
Why
time.
that year, though? Just
in her book, Cities and the Wealth of Nations, she talks about certain defensive compulsive responses that empires or nations undertake to keep themselves together.
okay.
But these transactions, she says, they don't just cause decline; they literally are decline.
Yeah.
It's as if the state is cutting its vein and pouring its blood into the dirt in the actual. And for her, the three were unremitting defense spending, massive social welfare spending, and heavy promotion of advanced backward trade. And that's a bigger picture. But 20 years before that, because she was born in 1916, she thought that the problem started when they put the wainscoting.
Okay.
I'm back.
Welcome.
Yeah.
So where I was, we only were cut off there for a very short millisecond, but Jane Jacobs thought when they put this wainscoting and they hid the gears of the train, and suddenly people wanted, well, C.S. Lewis talks about this, that people wanted from technology a kind of magical alchemy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was no longer, a celebration of the world God made and how we can cooperate with it, but they want that magic button.
Yeah.
And you can see that, just how that's gone gangbusters. It's interesting, because Peter Thiel said, what happened to the future? We expected flying cars, and instead we got 150 characters, meaning Twitter. But I think he's wrong. I mean, he certainly he's on to something there, but he's wrong, because flying cars is like a demonic fantasy, whereas 150 characters is democracy on a global scale. It's people engaging and thinking. I think there's, I think, you can't make light of it or too much of the other thing. Yeah. But anyway, my point is, Jacobs is saying, beware of that lust for a magical technology.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I wonder whether technology has always been a dream of magic, in fact. I mean, and the difference between technology and real techne in kind of the
What's the difference there? What's the difference? Like, what about like ancient metallurgy or something? Was that already magical?
In the same sort of sense, yeah. I mean, so what is the difference between? I mean, what is magic at the heart of it? I mean, it's an attempt to instrumentalize superhuman powers. Instrumentalize them. And that's the difference between magic, which is always superstitious, and real religion, at the core of which is worship, which is exactly unmagical. Worship is magical, unmagical in this kind of demonic sense. I mean, worship is in fact placing ourselves at the before what's greater than us and allowing it to be greater than us, rather than merely instrumental.
Right.
Yeah, it is interesting with the kind of alchemical stuff. I mean, it bears some reflection on why the founders of the modern science, which was always technological in its guts, was the founders were all profoundly interested in alchemy and magic and stuff at the same time. We tend to think of modern science is having finally gotten rid of magic, but it was a kind of C.S. Lewis talks about this, but I mean it was obsessed with magic from the beginning, and that's worth recalling. So that the things like the covering the gears and operations of the choo-choo train are not, I mean, that's not an aberration from something. There's something already sort of built into certain kinds of
Sure. Yes.
direction.
And somehow this desire for, a friend of mine had an outlandish but true story from the 1905 World's Fair in St. Louis. I think this was one of the first, these expositions to have, it was like, the pre-Epcot, to have like pavilions of different nations. Meet Me in St. Louis, the Judy Garland movie, actually culminates with this eschatological vision of the city of the future at the St. Louis World's Fair.
Oh,
And that's the song Meet Me in St. Louis, is to be there at this. And somebody had the idea to build a full-scale replica of the Holy Sepulchre and parts of the old city of Jerusalem at the freaking heart of the World's Fair. And they and in fact, if you go to the closing sequence of the film, which you can, of course it's colorized and all that, or I guess it was in color, I don't know, it was a 1949 film or something, but it's a pretty phenomenal thing, and you have a glimpse of the Jerusalem pavilion there if you know where to look.
Yeah, that wouldn't happen these days, probably.
And and my friend was telling me that somehow they found some Orthodox priest from Syria. I think he might even be a saint in the Antiochian church now, or is about to be canonized, and they invited him to come and do a liturgy at the Holy Sepulchre.
Wow. Wow. Yeah.
And he did.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that too, that I think in America it's a little different. Western European alchemy is one thing, but Americans wanted, they wanted they wanted to be the new Israel.
Yeah. Yeah.
They wanted their cities to be the gleaming city of the Revelation, to be a foursquare Bible church, with a perfect cube of a city. And I've seen at my brother-in-law's house in Wheeling, West Virginia, his old house. I think he just bought a church. It's a perfect cube that it's all in that. There were I think Michael Lewis, not the Michael Lewis, that the famous one, but the one who should be famous, has written a book about this, and the attempt in American urban planning to capture this apocalyptic city. I mean, apocalyptic in the tame sense.
Yeah. That's something I think I should look into. That would be really interesting. I mean, this sort of shifts
because it's rough for Protestants, right? That they reject the sacramental life.
Yeah.
And that produced some hunger. And that, that comes out in ways like, Pentecostalism, like sort of the ultimate, realized eschatology, or just this sense that we're living, in New Testament times, if we're Christians, or this approach to urban planning, which has proven so fatal for our cities.
Yeah. I mean, that's, and the various revivals that we've experienced. I mean, it seems like every 30 or 40 years there's another one. But that I mean, you actually put your finger exactly on the I think what is the neuralgic point, and the thing worth considering is can you do that outside of a sacramental life? Can you actually have the temple in the middle of the city, as you described, in a genuine sense, if there isn't a kind of a sense of tradition, a real organic sense of tradition? And what I mean, I mean a lot more by that word, I think, than most people would conventionally mean. I mean it in a really, really rich sense of anyway, let me just bracket that. But tradition and incarnation, sacrament, the whole sort of unfolding of the history of Christianity, whether that's significant to the meaning, even the content of Christianity, so that, if you try to invent a city in a new world as a biblically founded city, if that doesn't already incarnate a kind of a problematic rupture. I see as I'm saying this that I would need all sorts of qualifications, but I guess that the simple point that I'm making is, what's the difference between a Christianity that's thought of as basically a message that can be abstracted from any particular form or history, and then introduced in different places in a way indifferently, or a Christianity that's actually organic and continuous with the incarnation in history and so forth. That these generate very different senses, it seems to me, of what it would mean to have a church at the center of the city.
Yeah, I think the plan was to put this New Jerusalem on the road, actually, or not this New Jerusalem, this old Jerusalem, that they were going to tour it.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
really, what stole the show, and you see it in the last 5 minutes of the movie, which I recommend anyone to watch on. You can just find closing
yeah,
scene. Is the electricity. It's the lights, and it's the monumentality, which then American cities aspire to be. These cities of pure sacredness,
yeah,
shining all souls.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's really
And presumably in that city, work is fun. It's not, people are in some kind of eudaimonia, or whatever the biblical equivalent of that is. And but I'm thinking about, I'm remembering as a kid, I'm remembering one day in particular, a very intense game of Frisbee football that was so difficult and lasted so long. And that kind of euphoria of incredible struggle. And I think play is, it is preparation for work. Play is the work of children. And it's an important dimension of work, that enjoyment, the loss of the self, the full giving of the self, and it's certainly a dimension of liturgy, the ultimate work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think, and I think, that experience of that, I'm just remembering that particular day, it's completely bodily. It's everything. It's your mind. It's your body. It's just such a unity. It's certainly social.
Yeah.
There's such a reconciliation with the enemy in a great game, because your opponent and Lewis talked about this in War. There's a sense in which no one understands me as well as my enemy. Yeah. Certainly no one back in my home country.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's the guy that I just killed, or that just killed me, that is my closest brother. And I think there's a lot of just good things that come out of play, those kind of lessons. And
yeah, that's right. I mean, in a truly integrated economy, to use that word, work and play are intrinsically connected. So there's a work dimension in play. It can be toilsome. And I mean, your example, I think we've all had some experience of something like that.
Yeah.
I have one of the most vivid memories of my growing up was an experience I had sailing, which was just like that, and absolutely unforgettable. It was one of the most intense experiences of freedom that I've ever had. but then, and then,
freedom and yet crucifixion, right? Like
yeah.
it's perfect
Oh,
coinciding.
right, right.
Like
Yeah,
there's
no, it's, I mean, you're just, the sweat is pouring off, and it's, yeah, but it's ecstasy, it's ecstatic, really. And then the play dimension of work, because at the core of work in a real world, is if there's an intrinsic good there, there's something kind of contemplative, there's an enjoyment going on. And I mean, we all experience that in subtle ways all the time. I was thinking about, why do people enjoy so much baking bread, for instance? I don't know if you've had experience with baking bread, but there's something about, kneading this dough that is taking on a life of its own. And the just the contact with it is life-giving. I mean, you're both giving life to this reality, and it's sort of, there's a feedback. It's kind of giving life to you. I know some people that bake bread precisely as a response to stress and anxiety, and they say that there are few things like that. I think, having this direct engagement with things that are genuinely real, that adds a kind of contemplative enjoyment, even playful, liturgical, even dimension to our work.
no, I don't know anything about baking bread.
Right. You know something about playing guitar, what's yeah, what's the difference between when you pick up a guitar that's like a really well-made, beautifully crafted guitar, and like a almost plastic sort of piece of junk produced? I mean, it feels different in your hands, even the weight. There's so many subtle things. One, just holding it energizes you, and the other one, holding it sort of deadens you in a certain curious way.
I am not a good guitar player. For me, the guitar was always, it's kind of supporting my real instrument, which was the voice, which I kind of, I think I don't know how I lost it. I think I just destroyed it through coffee or something. So there's,
Uh-oh.
but certainly, yes, that certainly when using my voice to its ultimate, and many years ago, was that sensation of the fulfillment and the simultaneous loss of the self. And and that aspect I can speak to better. I mean, yeah, things well made, you see them less often now, I guess. Trying to think, what is my, yeah, one of my sayings is, the purpose of being rich is so that you can afford to buy products from companies that don't care about the customer. They don't care. They are making perfection because they have to.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's, when you there's something so cloying about customer service and trying to please the customer, and just like, to put that second commandment of love your neighbor above the commandment to love perfection, to love your vision of God in your work, is so completely insulting to everything. And you really want to buy stuff from people who, if the customer doesn't care or can't see, they don't care. They have to make it great.
Yeah. No, that's an experience I've had recently in Italy. There's something really, I think, for an American, it's often astonishing how much you can be ignored by a waiter at a restaurant, and we just think, well, this is bad service. And I was there with my son. I was trying to explain, in one respect, Americans, we just expect to be attended to immediately, and that's the whole point of the waiter, is to satisfy the customer's desires as quickly as possible. I said, for an Italian, being a waiter is actually it's an art form, and there's a kind of way that a meal is meant to unfold, and he is participating in this, and he doesn't care whether you whether you like it or not. This is the way that a meal is meant to be eaten, and you need to sort of conform yourself to this order rather than being simply served by it. There's something really beautiful about that, and you can see this is why in a place like that, to be a waiter can really be a vocation almost. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but there's a sense in which you can give your life to this work and understand that how it's done. You've sort of mastered this. You know exactly what this is all about. It's kind of it's become part of who you are. It's very different from thinking of waiting tables in a purely instrumental way, that it's a part-time work over the summer, but nobody would ever do this for a living. And you can't do that for a living because it's not it's not connected to an intrinsic good. Whereas you could imagine doing something for a living, even if it's, as you say, not appreciated maybe by somebody.
Yeah, in France, the waiter is not going to ask you how the meal is. He doesn't care what you think, and if you have an opinion, you're probably wrong. I think it's true in religion, right? Like I think in Greece, for example, the priests don't care, right? They have a sense of what perfection in liturgy is and perfection in theology and religion is, and that's the drive. And really, no one faults them for that. People fault them if they lose their passion for it, right? No one's saying, oh, the church is not responsive to our needs or something.
Yeah.
And a church that were responsive to our needs, like I don't want to eat at Applebee's.
Yeah.
I want to eat at this great other place. So
yeah. No, that's a great point. And I mean, the needs of the church are to have a priest that isn't primarily concerned about the needs of the church. I mean, that's the irony. I mean, what we really need is someone who's concerned about something more than what we need. I mean, in a certain sense, right?
Yeah.
Concerned about God, the perfection of the liturgy. I mean, there's a radical difference between being in the celebration of the liturgy with the priest who is trying to connect to the audience and trying to be relatable and trying as distinct from one who is simply in the first place trying to be as radically open as possible to the mystery that's taking place here. And in one case you have a real window to the transcendent, and there isn't an experience of transcendence that takes place. And the other, it feels more transactional somehow, and more like a kind of a therapy session in a kind of banal sense.
People know they're going to die, and they want some encounter with values and realities that will transcend their own death, and if possible, the heat death of the universe. And economies and work can give people a glimpse of that, and they can give people some sense that there are some things that of whom the world is not worthy. And let the world and eventually it's enough that it produced those people, those things. I don't know where I'm going with that. I don't know what the dismount on that.
I mean, I don't know but one connection one can make with that observation is a theme that I you and I both are there's a convergence of interest, is the significance of beauty. I mean, that's exactly where beauty enters in, and it's interesting that we haven't used that word as far as I know. I guess there are a couple of oblique references, but mean, that would be, you know, something that's beautiful. It's not justify. It doesn't have to justify itself in terms of, you know, effects that it causes. It's already good. You know, it just the sheer fact that it exists is a justification. I mean, there'd be a lot more to say, but that's just first.
Joseph, you haven't, corralled us at all.
Yeah. Well, I've been enjoying where this has been going. Strangely, you've touched upon something that I had near the end of this list of questions in a lot of ways, without my tampering at all. So maybe the themes were subconsciously worked in from when you read the list. But one thing I had written down as like a subheading was Christopher Alexander, An Apophatic Hospitality to the Unexpected. And as a subnote to that, Play, The Problem of Design, The Attentional Commons, mentioning Crawford, and Imageless Prayer. Yeah, are you, either of you, familiar with the Notes on the Synthesis of Form, Alexander's smaller book?
No, I haven't read.
Okay. Well, he delineates the self-conscious and the unself-conscious culture. The unself-conscious culture being a traditional culture wherein the designer doesn't have to make self-conscious design decisions. He or she just uses the distributed consciousness of the tradition to address something that appears as a dissonance between the design and the conformity of the design context. So you just have something that appears, and you can kind of use the memory or the consciousness of the tradition to address the problem. Whereas in the self-conscious culture, which is like an abstract culture, instead you have a designer addressing a problem that's so infinitely complicated that it's impossible to address in its particularity. And so you have like a series of abstractions that have to be made in terms of articulating the problem. And then when you create a design that could theoretically address the problem, then you're moving into another kind of abstraction. And then when you reincarnate that abstraction, you've gone like 6 steps. So at this point, you're inserting something into the like incarnational context, which has at some point in the ether lost contact with the actual particularity of the system, which is totally the Jane Jacobs, theory, which is that urban design is basically completely imaginary. It doesn't have any contact with the real. But then you guys have brought up the notion of play. And then I wanted to bring up the notion of hospitality, as sort of the unknowing.
With everything at once.
Yeah, sorry.
Wait, what was the word with hospitality? Remind me again.
Apophatic hospitality.
Apophatic. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I want to talk about the way in which play is imageless, and that when we're playing, there's such a radical openness to the reality of the next thing that's coming, and it's not preconceived, and there's not some. And I think play is, when you're a child, is essential training for. And I think, when you look at how that happens, play presumes some kind of context of trust. Like the child is safe, they can play. They're safe enough with the people they're playing with. And certainly, our Savior teaching us how to pray by beginning Our Father, and having some sense that, that it isn't an abstraction, as you're saying, apophaticism, but it's something playful within the context of a proven relationship. I forgot what else I was going to say, but I think that's
yeah. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would want to qualify that and tell me what you think. When you say plays without is imageless, It seems to me I would want to say if and by that you mean, you know, there's not like a self-conscious image, like you've got a representation that precedes that you're imposing or something. That I think is true. I would agree with that. But it seems to me to call it imageless, it seems like the key isn't so much whether there's an image there or not. The key is whether it's an image that has been abstracted and has kind of become a kind of self-conscious thing, because there is a, you know, when a child is drawing something, there's an image that's being produced, but it's not first in his head that he's, you know, it's coming to be. And I mean, he is, and this I think is really worth reflecting on. The key is, there's a certain unself-consciousness that implies that the sort of anchor of his spiritual activity is outside of him. He's participating in something else, and that's his conscious life, his spiritual life has its center in this reality that's in front of him,
Right.
rather than having the, you know, the center being inside your abstract consciousness, and then somehow you're either trying to get out of it or trying to get it into your head or something like that. That's where the problems begin. Would you accept that kind of characterization?
I do. I don't think the apophaticism of play is sort of like, you know, a Buddhist no-mindness. It's not it, but there's a flavor of imagelessness, of unself-consciousness, of unpredeterminedness to it.
Yeah.
And even if it's already filled with what you're aiming for, it's already been filled. But that space could be filled, you know, is this flavor of imagelessness. But Joseph, when you were talking before, the thing that I thought about, you know, these choices in avoid, it sounds like dating. When people lose a close relationship to their context of their nation, of their place, of their wider family, that dating decisions take on this extreme abstraction about, you know, and they're trying to, you know, invent, and you see people go to a spiritual father or a therapist trying to somehow recover that parental role or some kind of a thing there. But you know, the decision is.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it amazing how that's a great example and illustration, and you see how, I mean, it's so extraordinary how these various things start to connect, and you see that there's a kind of similar pattern that gets expressed in these different areas. Yeah, to connect it also with the comments, Joseph, that you made about Christopher Alexander. I've not read his things on design. I know that he's highly regarded as a kind of an innovator and with real wisdom and insight there. I've read his things on the nature of order and timeless way of building, and I mean, have a very deep regard for him, respect for him. Especially this, you know, I actually had it in mind when I was talking about putting your hands on something that's life-giving. I mean, that would be yeah. And he once made this just offhand comment, and it's so it's one of these things that seems to be trivial, but you think about the implications, and they just unfold into greater and greater matters. He made a distinction between when you're paying for something, pulling out actual bills, paper bills, and paying with bills, as opposed to using a credit card. And he said that the credit card, there's something sort of life destroying in that transaction. I mean, that's a big sort of a grandiose word, but I mean, in a subtle way, I think we all recognize it. Whereas he said that there's something about actually handling these bills and handing them over that's more life-giving. And you know, it's such a subtle point, but you see that there is what, you know, what's the difference? I mean, they're both abstractions of a sort, but there's something more abstract even in a credit card. There's something about the history of a bill that has been in other hands, before it's been in yours and will be in other hands. And it sort of carries a kind of a value in a more genuinely symbolic way than the pure instrumental sign of a credit card and the pure functionality of a credit card. And I think connects too with this prior, where is the integrating point of our spiritual life? Is it in realities in which we encounter, in relation to which we encounter each other? Or is the integrating point abstractions in our consciousness that then we try to impose on the world? That seems to be one of the patterns that connects a lot of the things we've been discussing.
And Alexander, incidentally, he thought ideally the architect should be the general contractor, the builder, so that that the design could be somewhat apophatic. Like you come up with this design of the house, but there's a kind of it's probably over an exaggeration. It's a kind of quantum indeterminacy to the final details. Exactly where will the window go? And Jeffrey Carson, I don't know if he's still living. One of the most interesting people I've ever heard of. He and his wife, when they were in college, were in the early 70s, were backpacking around Greece. They weren't Greek. And they returned after college and settled in the island of Paros, and they just scrounged and made a life there. They learned Greek, and then I think I have his name right, Jeffrey Carson, but he ended up becoming the main translator into English of poets like Seferis and other Nobel Prize winning Cavafy, but I saw an interview with him, and he describes building in Paros in the 70s, that guys building the house, when it came time to put in the window, when they get that high, they could spend an afternoon deciding at the end of the day, where does it go? And so there is some kind of an indeterminacy that feels like apophaticism to me. It feels like some openness, some striving after a more pure inner state of hospitality, like you said, to the messages, or as Jane Jacobs said at the end of her life, the invitations. The window, or the creator of windows, wants it here and not 6 inches to the left. And I was on a walk once outside of Rockville, Maryland, or somewhere in Gaithersburg, and I saw an American barn like this from maybe the 20s or the 30s. That thing, it was on fire with holiness, and it was a decaying barn, but somebody thought about it, and every curve of it, every corner, it had that good shape. I mean, you could not escape the sense that you were, it's one of the most profound things I've ever seen.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I mean, we can bring this sort of full circle here, with the hands-on sort of knowledge. I mean, think about it. Like you couldn't figure out where the window's supposed to be just through what do they call that? The architect's designing program. I forget what it's called.
The CAD, computer.
CAD, right. Yeah. I mean, you can get a certain idea, but there's something about actually being there and being able to walk around it and seeing it from the different inside, outside, seeing what you can see from the window, seeing how it fits, that there's something about the absolute concreteness of the particular circumstances that you need to have a kind of hands-on connection to. And what's so interesting, I mean, is, as you just put it, the creator of Windows wants this exactly here, not 6 inches to the left. How do you know that? Like what indicates that? And it's there's something about this convergence of order that just becomes crystal clear if you've been somebody who's through a kind of habituation has become sensitive to those sorts of judgments. And there's no replacement for that. That's the thing that's so interesting. you know, you can't learn to do that by reading a lot of books. There's something about having to actually go through the practice over and over again that you begin to see what's needed. That's really, you know, this is part of the embodied dimension of work that will never really be replaced.
And it's odd how Elon Musk, okay, the instrumental value of Neuralink is, you know, a fully quadriplegic person recovering use of their limbs. Okay. But the notion that I want in a non-bodily way to scroll the internet, no, I do not. And how will I get out of it? How will I stop? I won't be able to close my eyes to it. And, you know, or the singularity that I would want to put my consciousness absent my body. No, I don't. The whole point of asceticism is to, you know, is to embody, you know, and personalize the things that I do. And no, I don't want to be this Gnostic fiend.
Yeah.
You know, I'm looking
I mean,
forward.
even I doesn't mean anything anymore there. You're not, you can't even say I at that point.
Once you're in there,
yeah. Yeah.
You are, you know, someone will address this, you know, computer of the future, you know, who are you? And it'll say, we are Legion.
Yeah.
There'll be so many souls trapped in one interface.
Yeah. That's pretty interesting.
And
I have one maybe last thing we could bring up, if you both have a little more time, which is a bit of a pivot, but on the theme of instrumentalization in regards especially to language, you talk about sophistry, Dr. Schindler. I was wondering if you had any more thoughts about that. There's sophistry, like that could be applied to the problem of design as well, in the urban context, or basically the effacement of language, especially with AI, these large language models. Like with poetry, the whole point is that the language is not instrumental towards conveying a meaning. It's both foregrounded in the words themselves and in the meaning they convey.
Yeah.
But all of this is sort of called into question. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk about the theme of sophistry, especially in regards to language and commodity and things like that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I have to be careful when I say criticizing AI. Somebody in response to a comment I made sent me a poem that was produced through ChatGPT on some theme, and it was brilliant. It was actually really stunningly good, and I mean that's something worth reflecting on and has to be taken into consideration. Right. All that being said, there's a principle that I think that needs to be held on to regardless of the context, and that is, you know, what exactly is a word? You know, what is language? Plato is my is the one I follow on this. I have learned a great deal from Plato, and especially I know that we have a common teacher, Eric Pearl, on the meaning of Plato and the Neoplatonic tradition. But in any event, for Plato, you know, what the purpose of language is to make being apparent. It actually, it's the purpose of a word is to manifest reality. Now, it's also, as a secondary function, it is to communicate to another person and possibly to persuade. But that is, if you make that first, it changes the nature of communication. If you don't root things like communication root them in this more basic reality of making being manifest, you run into all sorts of problems. And I think that's the heart of his criticism of sophistry, is that language ceased to be this intrinsic participation in reality that amplifies it, in the way that poetry does, for instance. And instead, language is taken to be a pure tool, a pure instrument of persuasion, that you can learn sort of techniques and so forth, that ways to produce effects in an effective manner. And that pattern there, the difference between a kind of a techne that is rooted in reality on the one hand, and a technology, what I would call technology, that is abstracted from reality, and it's a pure technique, rationalized technique for the sake of producing effects. That kind of pattern you can see in all sorts of areas. Design would be one, like installing Windows is another. You have a program that tells you where to put the windows. That's very different from somebody on site looking at it, responding to the particularities, and then making a decision. In one case, you've got reality itself participating in the activity, and in the other case, you've got something that's being determined totally in abstraction, and then imposed. And I think the cultural implications, this is put fairly abstractly. If we had more time, we could work out details. But I think the cultural implications of the difference between those two things are infinite.
That's beautifully said. I just, in the light of having read The Death and Life of Great American Cities, as I'll walk down an American, a street in America, I'll often just think how much more information was embodied in the old cityscape, the old streetscape.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to Amsterdam today and you see, not only is every building unique and has so many stories at every level, but then, the shops, the sidewalk, the bike lane, the road, then you drop off, and then there's a whole nother world in the canals. So much information is available to you at all moments. And you walk through an American, efficient, street, and it has just been stripped of almost all information. There's just nothing there. Mm-hmm. It's just, some pattern that repeats just because it's easier to have it repeat. And it absorbs the entire block with one building. Mm-hmm. And we are living in a kind of dark age, in the sense that we've forgotten how to write in design and write in the things we create. And because we're not writing, there's no one reading. Yeah. There's nothing to be read. And this is our daily, experience, is kind of acuity. Yeah. Now I'm here in the Balkans, and the Balkans have their own kind of acuity, which is just the result of 600 years of the Ottomans or whatever. But but when you go to Western Europe, you see just the level, and old American cities, you can get it pretty quickly. Ultimately, I think, to go to Roy Rappaport, words are anchored in liturgy and in ritual. And for them to have stable meaning and real meaning, they require some kind of sacrifice behind them. There has to be some blood behind it. Mm-hmm. And this is, the danger of censorship, that it will limit the number of people who are willing to speak honestly and put their blood on the line.
There's something interesting. George Steiner says, the French American critic, he says that, one would think that censorship makes their less profound literature available, but he says, like, look at Russia. It's like, once you have all of this blood being spilled, it like hydrates the language.
Hopefully.
Yeah, that's right. That would be the hope. I like that. Blood. Right, that was an image that Nietzsche used in one respect. Also, I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Péguy. He's one of my favorites. But there's an infinite difference between someone who writes in ink and someone who writes in blood. The words means something different in the two cases. There's something to that.
Oh my God, that's depressing for writers. But yeah, are you writing in black?
And then there's the ones that just type in
I'm not sure that I am. Yeah.
Yeah. No, none of us do any of this adequately, but it's bracing to recall it. It seems to me and can be inspiring to recall it. Yeah. Maybe that's a good
I
note.
think that's a good spot. Yeah. Thank you both so much for your time. This was really good.
Thank
Well,
you.
I mean, the honor is mine, David. I'm heard about you so much for so long, so thank you.
Yeah. I think we're sort of fruits from the same tree, or at least from the same grove. Some of the authors that we admire, although I don't have the knowledge of Jane Jacobs, who's clearly really fundamental to you. But
Are you a Robin Darling Young fan also?
yes, yeah. I never took a class with her, but I knew her. She and my father were good friends, and was on various sort of academic retreats where she was present and things. So got to know her pretty well. But yeah, Eric Pearl was probably my main teacher in grad school.
Yeah, those are profound people.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to stop recording, gentlemen.
Yes.
Hey.